I watched Marcus sign his name on the contract with a flourish, his Mont Blanc pen scratching across the premium paper like a death sentence he didn't know he was writing. My husband, no, my ex-husband in a timeline he couldn't remember, smiled at me across the mahogany conference table, completely unaware that the loyalty clause he'd forced me to sign 3 years ago was about to become his noose. There, he said, sliding the document back to our lawyer. Happy now, Olivia? I let my lips curve into something that might pass for a smile if he wasn't paying attention. He wasn't. Marcus never paid attention to me unless he needed something. Very. The meeting was for our company's Series C funding round. Nexus Technologies, the startup we'd built together, or rather, the startup I'd built while he'd taken credit. In my previous life, this meeting had gone differently. I'd signed away my rights piece by piece, trusting my husband, believing his promises that we were partners. That had been my first mistake. My last had been trusting him with my life. I could still feel the cold water of the bay closing over my head, still taste the salt and diesel as I'd sunk below the surface of the marina, my lungs burning. The police had called it an accident. My grieving husband had inherited everything. The autopsy had shown elevated levels of sedatives in my system, but not enough for anyone to question the narrative Marcus had spun. His poor, depressed wife who'd been drinking at a company party, who'd wandered too close to the edge. But death had given me an unexpected gift. I'd woken up 3 years earlier, the morning after our wedding, with every memory of what was to come burned into my consciousness like a brand. Ms. Chen, if you'll just review Section 12 one more time, Jonathan Kim, our lawyer, said, pushing another document toward Marcus. The loyalty clause works both ways. Since you're insisting on implementing it company-wide, you'll need to be bound by it as well. Marcus barely glanced at it. He'd always been arrogant, but his confidence in this moment was particularly delicious. In my first life, he'd made me sign this clause 6 months into our marriage when I was still stupid enough to believe in us. It had seemed reasonable then. Neither partner could work for a competitor or start a competing business for 5 years after leaving Nexus. The penalty was forfeiture of all company shares and any intellectual property developed during the tenure. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd spent the last 3 years carefully laying groundwork he couldn't see. In this timeline, I'd been patient. I'd played the devoted wife, the supportive co-founder. I'd let him think he was the brains behind Nexus, while I'd quietly secured the one thing that mattered: leverage. It's fine, Marcus said, scrawling his signature. Standard non-compete. Protects both of us. Protects you, I thought. Or it would have if you hadn't taught me exactly how ruthless I needed to be. The lawyer collected the documents and Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and I saw the slight tightening around his eyes. That would be Sabrina Chen. No relation despite the shared surname. His mistress, his business partner in the company he'd been secretly building to compete with Nexus. In my previous life, I hadn't discovered the affair until 6 months before my death, and by then, Marcus had already siphoned off our key clients, our proprietary code, and half our engineering team. This time, I'd known about Sabrina from the moment he'd met her at a tech conference in Austin. I'd known because I'd lived it before. I'd watched him fall for her sharp ambition and sharper cheekbones. I'd watched him plan my destruction while kissing me goodnight. I need to take this, Marcus said, standing. Investor call. Of course. I kept my voice warm, understanding. The perfect, supportive wife. He left the conference room and Jonathan started gathering his papers. You sure about this, Olivia? The loyalty clause is pretty ironclad. If either of you violates it, I'm sure. I met his eyes. Jonathan had been Marcus's law school buddy, but he was a professional. He'd execute the contract exactly as written, regardless of personal loyalty. We both need to be held to the same standard. What I didn't say was that I'd already confirmed Marcus was in violation. Not yet in action, he was too smart for that, but in preparation. Over the past 3 months, while I'd pretended to know nothing, Marcus had incorporated a new company in Delaware, Chromatech Solutions. He'd filed for preliminary patents on algorithms that were suspiciously similar to the ones we'd developed at Nexus. He'd held meetings with our largest clients, planting seeds of doubt about Nexus's stability. He'd done it all through Sabrina's name, of course. Nothing directly traceable to him, but I'd traced it anyway, with the help of people he didn't know I'd cultivated. In my previous life, I'd been isolated. Marcus had slowly, methodically cut me off from my college friends, my family, anyone who might have questioned his narrative. This time, I'd kept those relationships alive. I'd also made new ones, specifically with people who had reason to dislike my husband. Like Thomas Rodriguez, the developer Marcus had fired 2 years ago for performance issues. In reality, Thomas had questioned some of Marcus's more aggressive accounting practices. I'd quietly hired Thomas as a consultant, paying him through a separate LLC I'd established before the wedding. Thomas had been very interested in documenting certain irregularities in how Marcus had been managing our company finances. Or like Jennifer Park, the venture capitalist Marcus had publicly humiliated at a pitch competition. Jennifer now sat on the board of directors of 3 companies that were considering partnerships with Nexus. She'd been very receptive when I'd reached out to discuss concerns about corporate governance. I'd spent 3 years building a web, and Marcus had walked right into the center of it, blind and arrogant. Olivia? I looked up to find Jonathan watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Yes? Be careful. I've known Marcus a long time. He doesn't like to lose. Neither do I said softly. Not anymore. The company party was in full swing when I arrived at our Tribeca loft that evening. Marcus had insisted on hosting. He always insisted when it gave him a chance to perform. To be the brilliant CEO, the visionary founder, the man everyone wanted to please. I'd let him have that in my first life. I'd stood in the background, managing the actual operations while he schmoozed investors and press. I'd coded until 3 a.m. while he took meetings at expensive restaurants. I'd built our flagship product, the neural network that could predict market trends with 87% accuracy, while he'd claimed credit in interviews. Olivia! Sabrina materialized at my elbow, champagne glass in hand and predatory smile fixed in place. You look exhausted. Are you feeling all right? In my first life, I'd thought Sabrina was a friend. We'd met through Marcus, and she'd been so supportive, so understanding when I'd needed to vent about work stress. I'd told her everything, every frustration, every doubt, every technical challenge I was working through. She'd listened with such sympathy, then she'd packaged it all up and sold it to my husband as a blueprint for destroying me. I'm perfect, I said, matching her smile, just putting in the hours. You know how it is with a startup. Oh, absolutely, her eyes gleamed. Though you should really delegate more. That's what you have employees for. Marcus says the same thing. He's very smart. Sabrina touched my arm, and it took everything in me not to recoil. You're lucky to have him. I am, I agreed. He's one of a kind. Across the room, Marcus was holding court with a group of junior developers, explaining some concept he'd clearly Googled 5 minutes before. One of them, Kevin, fresh out of Stanford, was watching with apparent awe. I remembered Kevin. In 6 months, Marcus would try to recruit him to Chromatech. Kevin would hesitate, conflicted about loyalty, until Marcus offered him triple his salary and a director title. I'd already offered Kevin a promotion and a retention bonus at Nexus. He didn't know it yet, but I'd also seeded his GitHub with contributions to some high-profile open-source projects, building his reputation. Kevin would have options Marcus hadn't counted on. I should go mingle, Sabrina said. But let's do lunch soon. I feel like we haven't really talked in ages. Definitely, I lied. I watched her glide away, a predator in Louboutins and designer silk. In my previous life, our lunch talks had been intelligence-gathering sessions where she'd extracted information about our product roadmap, our client relationships, our technical challenges, information that had ended up in Marcus's hands, then in Chromatech's patents. This time, I'd been feeding her carefully curated misinformation. She thought our next product release would focus on cryptocurrency applications, a market I knew was about to crater. She thought we were having server stability issues that would cost us our anchor client. She thought I was working on an algorithm that would be easy to replicate. None of it was true. Our actual next product was something I'd kept completely off the books, developed in secret with a small team Marcus didn't know about. It would revolutionize supply chain logistics and was already being beta tested by 2 Fortune 500 companies under an NDA so airtight that even our board didn't know the details. There's my brilliant wife. Marcus appeared at my side, sliding an arm around my waist. To anyone watching, we looked like the perfect power couple. I was just telling the team about your latest work on the prediction algorithm. My work. That he'd take credit for in the press release tomorrow. It's a team effort, I said, playing my role. Modest as always. He kissed my temple and I felt nothing but cold calculation. You're the real genius here. I just handle the business side. That was almost funny. Marcus handled the business side the way a fox handles a henhouse. In my first life, I'd discovered too late that he'd been systematically hiding revenue in offshore accounts, underreporting our actual financial health to keep my share valuation low. When I'd finally seen the real books, 2 weeks before my death, I'd realized he'd stolen over $40 million from what should have been our shared assets. This time, I had Thomas Rodriguez conducting a forensic audit. The results were already in a locked safe deposit box, along with evidence of Marcus's planned betrayal with Chromatech, my insurance policy. Marcus, we need to talk about the Chen Industries deal, said Paul Morrison, our CFO. Another Marcus loyalist, though Paul's loyalty was more about self-preservation than actual respect. Paul had cooked the books in my first life, though he'd been smart enough to do it in ways that left Marcus's fingerprints instead of his own. Can it wait? Marcus asked. But Paul's expression said it couldn't. I'll leave you to it, I said, extracting myself from Marcus's grip. I should check on the caterers anyway. I didn't check on the caterers. Instead, I slipped into Marcus's home office and locked the door behind me. I had maybe 10 minutes before someone would notice my absence, and I needed to work fast. Marcus's laptop sat on his desk, password protected but not as secure as he thought. I'd watched him type it enough times in my previous life to know the pattern. M@RCU 2019, the year he'd graduated from Wharton, because my husband was nothing if not predictable in his arrogance. The laptop opened and I plugged in the USB drive I'd been carrying. It contained a keylogger, not to steal information since I already knew everything he was planning, but to document it. Every email he sent to Sabrina, every file he transferred to Chromatech, every client he pitched in violation of his contract with Nexus. In my first life, I'd had suspicions but no proof. This time, I'd have everything. The software installed in 43 seconds. I cleared the history, shut down the laptop, and slipped out of the office just as I heard Marcus's laugh booming from the living room. He was telling the story about how he'd pitched to Sequoia Capital, conveniently forgetting that I'd been the one to develop the technology they'd actually invested in. There you are. Jennifer Park, champagne glass in hand, smiled as I approached. Hell of a party. Marcus likes to celebrate. I kept my voice neutral, but Jennifer's smile sharpened. I bet he does, though I noticed most of the celebrating seems to be about his achievements. I didn't respond, just sipped my own champagne. Jennifer and I had been having careful conversations over the past year. Nothing too explicit, but she'd made it clear she thought Nexus's board needed more independent oversight. She'd also made it clear she hadn't forgotten how Marcus had called her investment strategy overly conservative at a panel discussion, implying she didn't understand tech startups because she was a woman. Marcus had a gift for making enemies. He just never expected them to compare notes. I've been reviewing the contracts you sent over, Jennifer said quietly. The loyalty clause is interesting. Very enforceable, according to my legal team. That's what I thought. If someone were to violate it, the penalties would be severe. Forfeiture of all shares and IP rights, I confirmed. Plus financial damages. Could bankrupt someone if they'd invested enough in a competing venture. I met her eyes. It could. Jennifer raised her glass in a subtle toast. To loyalty. To loyalty, I echoed. The next 3 months were a masterclass in patience. I watched Marcus and Sabrina accelerate their plans for Chromatech. I watched him poach 2 more of our engineers with promises he'd have to keep once he made his move. I watched him court our clients with barely disguised promises that he'd be starting something new, something better than Nexus. And I watched the keylogger document everything. Meanwhile, I ran Nexus, actually ran it, not just managed it while Marcus took credit. Our revenue grew by 43% quarter over quarter. Our new logistics product, still under wraps, passed every beta test with flying colors. The Fortune 500 companies testing it wanted to sign contracts the moment we were ready to launch. I also laid more groundwork. I secured board seats for 2 more independent directors who owed nothing to Marcus. I established relationships with 3 major VC firms that Marcus had alienated over the years with his condescension and broken promises. I made sure everyone who mattered in our industry knew that I was the technical genius behind Nexus's success. Not publicly, not yet, but in quiet conversations, in private demos, in carefully orchestrated meetings where Marcus was conveniently absent. I built my reputation while he tore his down. "You've been working late a lot," Marcus said one night, 4 months after the contract signing. We were in bed, the lights off, and his hand was on my hip in what might have been affection if I didn't know better. "Big product launch coming up," I said. "I want it to be perfect." "You always want everything to be perfect." There was an edge to his voice I remembered from my first life, right before things had turned truly ugly. Resentment, fear, the dawning awareness that he needed me more than I needed him. "Is that a problem?" "No, of course not." His hand tightened slightly. "I just worry about you. You're under so much stress." "You mean you're worried I'll find out what you're planning?" I thought. "You're worried I'll be harder to get rid of than you thought." In my first life, the gaslighting had started around this time. The suggestions that I was overworked, overtired, maybe even unstable. The comments about my drinking at company events, even though I barely touched alcohol. The concerned conversations with friends about how worried he was about my mental health. It had been a long game, making sure that when I died, everyone would think it was plausible that I'd killed myself. Depression, instability, the pressure of running a startup. It had all fit together so perfectly. "I'm fine," I said, turning to face him in the darkness. "Better than fine, actually. I think this product launch is going to change everything for us." "That's great, babe." But his voice was tight. He didn't want Nexus to succeed anymore. Every success made it harder for him to justify abandoning the company, harder to poach clients by claiming we were failing. "We should celebrate," I continued. "Maybe take a vacation after the launch, just the 2 of us?" "I'd love that," Marcus lied. "Let's look at dates." We wouldn't look at dates. In 6 weeks, 6 weeks, Marcus was planning to make his move. I knew because the keylogger had captured his calendar invite to Sabrina, Chromatech launch strategy meeting. He thought he'd kept it off his work computer, but he'd gotten sloppy, checking his personal email on his laptop one night after too much scotch. 6 weeks. I had 6 weeks to finish preparing. "Marcus?" I let my voice go soft, vulnerable. "Do you ever think about what would happen if Nexus failed?" He went still. "Why would you think about that?" "I don't know. I guess I just wonder sometimes if we're too dependent on this, if we should have a backup plan." I felt him relax slightly. He thought I was breaking, showing weakness. "We could always start something new," he said carefully. "If we had to, we did it. Once we could do it again." "You really think so?" "I know so." His hand moved to my face, thumb stroking my cheek in what someone who didn't know him might think was tenderness. "We're a team, Liv. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The lies came so easily to him. In my first life, I'd believed everyone. I'd thought we were partners, lovers, best friends. I'd thought the man I married was brilliant and driven and maybe a little ruthless. But that ruthlessness was aimed at our competitors, not at me. I'd been so fucking naive. "Together," I echoed, and kissed him, and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of watching him believe he was winning. The product launch happened on a Thursday in September, exactly 5 weeks before Marcus's planned betrayal. I'd moved the timeline up deliberately, wanting to control the sequence of events. The launch was spectacular. A live demo at TechCrunch Disrupt with me on stage explaining the technology while Marcus watched from the wings. In my first life, he'd been on stage and I'd been in the wings. He'd fumbled the technical questions and I'd watched our credibility slip away in real time. This time, I answered every question perfectly. I demonstrated our logistics algorithm predicting supply chain disruptions with 93% accuracy. I showed how it could save Fortune 500 companies hundreds of millions in efficiency gains. The audience gave me a standing ovation. Marcus's smile was frozen as I left the stage. That was amazing, Liv. Thanks. I accepted the champagne someone handed me. I think it went well. You should have let me know you were doing the demo yourself. I could have helped you prepare. I was prepared. I met his eyes. Besides, you always say I should take more credit for the technical work. His jaw tightened. Of course, I just meant... Marcus Chen? A reporter from TechCrunch appeared at his elbow. Can I get a quote about your wife's presentation? It was incredible. Is it true she developed the entire algorithm herself? I watched Marcus war with himself. He wanted to take credit, to downplay my role. But there were too many witnesses, too many people who knew the truth now. Olivia's the technical genius, he said, the words clearly painful. I just handled the business side. And quite well from what I hear. Your revenue growth has been exceptional. We have a great team. The reporter turned to me. Ms. Chen, there are rumors that several major companies are interested in licensing your technology. Can you comment? We're in discussions, I said carefully. But I can confirm that the response has been overwhelming. We've already had to expand our engineering team to handle the anticipated demand. What I didn't mention was that those licensing deals would be worth over $200 million in the first year alone. Or that the contracts were structured to give Nexus, and specifically me, as the named inventor, ongoing royalties that would dwarf our current revenue. Marcus didn't know about the licensing deals yet. He thought the launch was just a demo, a way to drum up interest. He was going to be very surprised when the announcement came next week. After the reporter left, Marcus grabbed my arm, not hard enough to bruise, but firmly enough that I couldn't easily pull away. Meh. We need to talk. Not here. No, not here. His smile was back in place, but his eyes were cold. Tonight, after dinner. Of course. I knew what he was going to say. He was going to accelerate his timeline. My success made him dangerous. It meant I had value he couldn't easily replicate, which meant I'd be harder to discard. He'd have to be more aggressive, move faster. That was fine. I was ready. Dinner was at 11 Madison Park, Marcus's favorite restaurant. It was also where he'd taken Sabrina on their first date, though he didn't think I knew that. In my first life, I'd found the receipt weeks after my death. Or rather, the private investigator I'd hired had found it, though I hadn't lived long enough to see the report. This time, I'd hired the investigator much earlier. I had photos, dates, hotel receipts, more insurance. You were incredible today, Marcus said, raising his wine glass. He'd ordered the most expensive bottle on the list, which meant he was either celebrating or softening me up. Truly, I'm proud of you. Thank you. I sipped my own wine carefully. In my first life, this was the dinner where he'd first started drugging me. Small doses of benzodiazepines in my drinks, making me groggy and forgetful, building a pattern. I'd switched our glasses when he'd gone to the bathroom. I've been thinking, Marcus continued, about what you said the other night, about backup plans. Oh? I think you were right. We should diversify, not abandon Nexus, of course, but maybe start exploring other opportunities. What kind of opportunities? He leaned forward, his expression earnest. This was the Marcus who'd convinced me to marry him, to start a company with him, to trust him with everything. I've been talking to some people about a new venture, something in the blockchain space. High risk, high reward. Blockchain, of course. It was trendy, it was buzzword heavy, and it was the perfect cover for siphoning money from Nexus. Sounds interesting. I knew you'd think so. The thing is, it would require some capital, a significant investment. How significant? $10 million to start. Maybe 20 if we want to scale quickly. I let surprise show on my face. That's a lot of money, Marcus. I know, but think of it as insurance. If anything happened to Nexus, we'd have something else, a safety net. If anything happened to Nexus. If he sabotaged it, he meant. If he destroyed the company I'd built so he could start fresh with Sabrina without me. I don't know, I said slowly. That's almost half our liquid assets. Which is exactly why it makes sense. Diversification, Liv. Basic investment strategy. I pretended to consider it, then nodded. Okay, but I want to see the business plan first, and I want our lawyer to review any agreements. Marcus's smile tightened. Of course. Though, honestly, I think we can handle this one ourselves. Jonathan charges an arm and a leg, and it's pretty straightforward. I'd still feel better having him look at it. Sure, whatever makes you comfortable. But his hand clenched around his fork, and I knew I'd added another complication to his plan. Good. There's something else, Marcus said. I've been approached about a speaking engagement. 3-week tour through Asia. Singapore, Tokyo, Seoul, tech conferences, some meetings with potential investors. That's great, I said, even though my heart was racing. In my first life, he'd taken a similar trip 6 months before my death. I'd later learned he'd been setting up Chromatech's international partnerships, laying the groundwork to steal our Asian clients. The thing is, they want me to leave next month. I know it's sudden, but the exposure would be incredible for Nexus. For Chromatech, I thought. You're not even subtle anymore. You should go, I said. I can hold down the fort here. Relief flashed across his face. You're sure? Absolutely, it's a great opportunity. What I didn't say was that I'd been hoping he'd take the trip. 3 weeks with him out of the country meant 3 weeks to make final preparations without him looking over my shoulder. 3 weeks to position every piece exactly where I needed it. You're amazing, Marcus said, reaching across the table to take my hand. Asali, I don't tell you that enough. No, I agreed. You don't. His smile faltered slightly, but he recovered. When I get back, let's take that vacation we talked about. Maybe the Maldives? Just us. No work, no phone calls. The Maldives. Where in my first life I'd died. He'd suggested the same trip then, and I'd been so happy, thinking he wanted to reconnect. Instead, he'd wanted me somewhere remote, somewhere it would be easy for an accident to happen. That sounds perfect, I lied. We finished dinner, Marcus paid with his corporate card, charging it to Nexus, naturally, and we went home. He poured us brandy from the decanter in the living room, and again I switched the glasses when he wasn't looking. I'd replaced the brandy weeks ago with a bottle from the same distiller, just in case he'd tampered with it. Paranoid? Maybe, but I was alive, and in my first life, I'd been too trusting. To us, Marcus said, raising his glass. To loyalty, I countered, and watched his smile freeze for just a moment before he recovered. To loyalty, he echoed and drank. Marcus left for Asia 2 weeks later. I drove him to JFK, kissed him goodbye, and watched his plane take off with relief flooding through my veins. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks. The first thing I did was call an emergency board meeting. Marcus wasn't required to be present. We had 5 board members now, and I'd made sure 3 of them were allies. Jennifer Park, obviously. David Wu, a tech entrepreneur Marcus had once tried to buy out for pennies on the dollar. And Patricia Okonkwo, a former SEC lawyer who took corporate fraud very, very seriously. Thank you all for coming on short notice, I said, standing at the head of the conference table. Thomas Rodriguez sat to my right, laptop open, and a thick folder of documents in front of him. I've discovered some irregularities in our corporate finances that I think the board needs to be aware of. Paul Morrison, our CFO, went pale. He'd known this was coming. I'd given him 3 days' notice that I was requesting a full audit, and he'd scrambled to cover his tracks. But Thomas was better than whoever Paul had hired to cook the books. What kind of irregularities? Asked Peter Chen, Marcus's old college friend and our final board member. He was the one vote I didn't have locked down. Thomas? I nodded to my consultant. Thomas pulled up a presentation on the screen. Over the past 3 years, approximately $42 million has been moved from Nexus's accounts into various offshore entities. The transfers were structured to avoid triggering reporting requirements, but they form a clear pattern. That's absurd, Paul said, but his voice was shaky. Those are legitimate business expenses. For what? Patricia Okonkwo's voice was sharp. According to these documents, the money was transferred to companies that don't appear to have any business relationship with Nexus. Some of them don't even have websites. They're contractors, consultants. Then produce the contracts, Patricia said. Show us what we paid for. Paul couldn't because the contracts didn't exist. The money had been siphoned off systematically, hidden in a maze of shell companies that all ultimately led back to Marcus's personal accounts. There's more, Thomas continued. 6 months ago, Chromatech Solutions was incorporated in Delaware. The CEO is listed as Sabrina Chen. No relation to the Chen family, obviously, but the majority shareholder appears to be a trust that's controlled by Marcus Chen. The room went silent. Peter Chen looked like he'd been slapped. Chromatech has filed provisional patents on technology that's remarkably similar to Nexus's proprietary algorithms, Thomas said. In fact, some of the code appears to be identical, just with variable names changed. That's corporate espionage, David Wu said quietly. And patent fraud. It's also a violation of the loyalty clause, I added. The one Marcus insisted we all signed 6 months ago. The one that prohibits working for or starting a competing business. Jennifer Park leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing at her lips. What are you proposing, Olivia? I'm proposing we enforce the contract, I said. Marcus violated the loyalty clause. According to the terms he wrote himself, that means he forfeits all his shares in Nexus and any rights to intellectual property developed during his tenure. That would make you the majority shareholder, Peter said slowly. It would. I met his eyes. I know Marcus is your friend, Peter, but he's been stealing from this company, from all of us. The evidence is right here. Peter looked at the documents Thomas was distributing, then at me. How long have you known? I suspected for months. I got confirmation 3 weeks ago. And you waited until Marcus was out of the country to bring this to the board? I wanted all the evidence first. And yes, I thought it would be easier to discuss without him here trying to talk his way out of it. He'll fight this, Paul warned. He'll claim the evidence is fabricated, that you're trying to steal the company. Let him fight, Patricia said. From what I'm seeing here, we could also report this to the SEC and possibly the FBI if the offshore accounts constitute money laundering. Paul went even paler. He was implicated too, and he knew it. I don't want to destroy Marcus, I said, which was a lie, but a necessary one. I just want to protect Nexus. We've worked too hard to build this company to watch it be cannibalized from the inside. I'll need time to review these documents, Peter said. Of course, take all the time you need, but I'd like to call a vote by the end of the week. Every day we wait is another day Marcus can transfer more assets, recruit more of our employees, steal more of our intellectual property. The board meeting ended with no clear resolution, but I could see I'd planted the seed. Peter Chen was loyal to Marcus, but he was also a businessman. If he thought Marcus was sinking anyway, he'd distance himself to protect his own reputation. The second thing I did was reach out to every journalist who'd ever interviewed Marcus and offer them a much better story. Not about the embezzlement, that would come later, but about the technology, about how I developed our core algorithms, about my vision for the company, about the licensing deals that were about to make Nexus one of the most valuable startups in the country. I gave interviews to TechCrunch, to Wired, to the Wall Street Journal. I did a podcast with a prominent venture capitalist who'd always thought Marcus was full of shit. I positioned myself not as Marcus's wife or co-founder, but as the technical genius behind Nexus's success. It wasn't ego, it was strategy. When the news about Chromatech broke, when Marcus's embezzlement became public, I needed the narrative to be clear. He was the parasite, and I was the one who'd built everything he'd tried to steal. The third thing I did was meet with our largest clients. Without Marcus there to charm them, I had to rely on the actual quality of our work. I brought Thomas and our lead engineer, Sarah Kim, and we did deep technical demos that showed exactly how our logistics, algorithm worked and why Chromatech's knockoff version would fail. Your husband's been telling us he's starting a new venture, said the CTO of one of our Fortune 500 clients. Implied it might be better than what you've got here. I'm aware, I said calmly. I'm also aware that he's been violating his employment contract to do it. Nexus will be enforcing our intellectual property rights aggressively. So there's going to be a legal battle? There's going to be a very short legal battle, I corrected. Marcus signed a loyalty clause. He violated it. The law is clear. The CTO studied me for a long moment. You know, I always thought he took too much credit for your work. He did. Well, for what it's worth, we're signing with Nexus regardless. Your technology is light years ahead of anything else on the market. We don't care who runs the company as long as the product keeps working. That was the message I heard again and again over those 3 weeks. The clients cared about the technology, not about Marcus's charisma. The investors cared about returns, not about his connections. The employees, at least the good ones, cared about working on interesting problems with competent leadership. Marcus had thought he was indispensable. He wasn't. By the time he landed at JFK 3 weeks later, I'd locked down every major contract, secured board approval to enforce the loyalty clause, and leaked enough information to the press that reporters were already calling his phone for comment on the Chromatech scandal. I picked him up at the airport like a dutiful wife, smiling as he kissed my cheek. How was the trip? I asked. Incredible. I think we're going to see some serious growth in the Asian market. I met with... He paused as his phone buzzed, and buzzed again, and kept buzzing. Popular guy? I said lightly. He glanced at the screen and I watched the blood drain from his face. What the fuck? Is something wrong? There's some kind of... He was scrolling frantically through messages. Someone leaked information about Chromatech. There are articles everywhere. Oh no, I said, my voice carefully concerned. What kind of information? But Marcus wasn't listening. He was calling Sabrina, his hands shaking. She didn't answer. He tried again, and again. Marcus, what's going on? Nothing, it's nothing. Just some confusion. But he was sweating now and his voice was tight with panic. We drove home in silence, Marcus glued to his phone. I could practically see the walls closing in on him as he realized how much trouble he was in. The articles weren't just about Chromatech. They detailed the financial irregularities at Nexus, the patent fraud, the evidence of corporate espionage. They didn't mention Marcus by name, not yet, but it was only a matter of time. I need to go to the office, Marcus said as soon as we got home, and I need to make some calls. Of course. Do what you need to do. He grabbed his laptop and left, and I waited exactly 15 minutes before following him. Not to the office. I knew he wouldn't actually go there. Instead, I drove to the apartment in Murray Hill that he'd been renting under an LLC. The apartment where he met Sabrina, where he kept his backup files for Chromatech, where he thought he was safe. I'd known about the apartment for months. I'd also known the building's super, a friendly guy named Luis, who was very interested in the fact that one of his tenants was running what appeared to be a corporate espionage operation. Luis had been documenting Marcus's visits, noting the times and dates. More evidence for the pile. I parked across the street and waited. 20 minutes later, Marcus's Tesla pulled up. He practically ran inside, laptop bag over his shoulder. Another 10 minutes and Sabrina arrived, looking equally panicked. I took photos, time-stamped, location tagged, then I drove back home and waited for Marcus to spin his story. He came home at 3 a.m, looking haggard. I was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine and a book, though I hadn't turned a page in hours. You're up, he said. I was worried. You said you'd be at the office. I was. I went there, but then I had to meet with... He ran a hand through his hair. It's complicated. What's going on, Marcus? The articles about Chromatech? Is that your company? I watched him calculate how much to tell me, how much I might already know, how much he could get away with. It's not what it looks like, he finally said. Chromatech was just an idea, a side project. I wasn't planning to compete with Nexus. But you filed patents. You incorporated a company. Research. I was doing market research on what our competitors might try. I was trying to protect Nexus, not hurt it. It was almost impressive how smoothly he lied. Then why didn't you tell me? I didn't want you to worry. You've been under so much stress with the product launch. Marcus. I set down my wine glass and looked at him directly. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the money you've been taking from Nexus. And I know about Sabrina. He froze. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. How long have you known? He asked finally. Does it matter? Olivia, listen to me. Whatever you think is happening, you're wrong. I can explain all of it. Can you explain the $42 million? Can you explain why Chromatech's patents are identical to our proprietary code? Can you explain why you've been recruiting our employees? I haven't. Don't. I stood up, and my voice was colder than I'd ever let it be before. Don't lie to me anymore. I have emails, Marcus. I have financial records. I have witness statements. I have everything. His face shifted, the mask of concern slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. You've been spying on me? You've been stealing from me, from us, from the company we built together. The company I built, he snapped. You're just the tech. I'm the one who made Nexus what it is. I'm the one with the vision, the connections, the business sense. You'd still be writing code in some basement without me. There it was, the truth he'd been hiding behind false praise and manipulation, the contempt he'd always felt for me. You're right, I said softly. I would be writing code, but I'd own that code. I'd own the patents, the intellectual property, all of it. You needed me, Marcus. You've always needed me. That's why you're so desperate to destroy me now, because you know you can't replicate what I've built. You think you're so smart, he said, and there was real venom in his voice now. You think you can run Nexus without me? You can't even handle the press without getting stage fright. I did a pretty good job at TechCrunch Disrupt. That was one presentation. Wait until you have to do it every week, every day. Wait until you have to manage investors and board members and employees who don't respect you. They respect me, Olivia. They'll leave when I do. Actually, it is said I've been talking to them, the employees, the investors, the board. And you know what I found? They don't respect you, Marcus. They tolerate you. They work with you because the technology is good and the technology is mine. You can't prove that. I can. I have documentation on every algorithm, every line of code. I have patents in my name. I have emails from employees crediting my work. You took credit, but that doesn't mean you actually did the work. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment I thought he might actually hit me. But he was too smart for that, too controlled. Violence would leave evidence. What do you want? He asked finally. I want you out of Nexus. The board is voting on Friday to enforce the loyalty clause. You violated it, so you forfeit your shares and all IP rights. I'll fight it. I'll tie it up in court for years. You could try, but I have enough evidence to refer this to the SEC and probably the FBI. Offshore accounts, money laundering, wire fraud. You're looking at serious prison time if this goes criminal. You wouldn't. Try me. I met his eyes. You made me sign that loyalty clause, Marcus. You wrote every word of it. You made it ironclad because you thought you'd use it to control me someday. You never imagined I'd use it against you. This is because of Sabrina, isn't it? You're jealous. I don't care about Sabrina. I care about my company. Your company? He laughed, bitter and sharp. It's our company, Liv. 50-50. That's what we agreed. You violated the contract. It's not 50-50 anymore. As of Friday, I'll be the sole owner of Nexus Technologies. You'll have nothing. I'll destroy you, Marcus said quietly. I'll tell everyone you're unstable, that you're paranoid, delusional. I'll make sure you never work in tech again. Go ahead, but the evidence speaks for Doise itself. And I have something you don't. Actual credibility. We'll see about that. He grabbed his laptop bag and headed for the door. I'm staying at a hotel. We'll talk when you're thinking more clearly. No, I said. We won't. File for divorce if you want, but you're not stepping foot in Nexus again. Security has already been notified that your access is revoked. Marcus paused at the door, his back to me. You'll regret this. No, I said softly. I really won't. He left, and I sat back down, hands shaking with adrenaline. This was it, the point of no return. In my first life, he destroyed me slowly, methodically until I had nothing left to fight with. This time, I'd destroyed him first. And I felt nothing but relief. The board vote happened on Friday, exactly as scheduled. Marcus showed up with a lawyer, ready to fight. But the evidence was overwhelming, and even Peter Chen, his friend, his ally, voted to enforce the loyalty clause. This is theft, Marcus shouted as the votes were counted. I built this company. You can't just take it from me. You violated your contract, Patricia Okonkwo said calmly. The contract you wrote? The penalties are explicitly stated. You forfeit your shares and all intellectual property rights. I'll appeal. I'll sue all of you. That's your right, Jennifer Park said. But in the meantime, the board's decision stands. As of today, you're no longer employed by Nexus Technologies. Security will escort you out. I watched Marcus being led from the building, still shouting threats. Sabrina was waiting for him outside. I could see her through the window, pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. Chromatech was dead in the water without the stolen technology, and she knew it. You did it, Jennifer said quietly, standing next to me at the window. He's finished. Not yet, I said, but soon. The press coverage was brutal. Once the story broke about the loyalty clause and Marcus's violation, reporters dug deeper. They found the offshore accounts, the suspicious transfers, the timeline of his relationship with Sabrina. They interviewed former employees who confirmed that I'd done most of the technical work while Marcus had taken credit. Within a week, Marcus went from celebrated CEO to cautionary tale. Other tech founders distanced themselves from him. Investors who'd been courting him for their own startups suddenly stopped returning his calls. Chromatech's investors pulled out, demanding their money back. Sabrina left him 2 weeks later. I heard through the grapevine that she'd found another rising star to attach herself to, someone who hadn't been publicly disgraced. Marcus called her a gold digger in a drunken voicemail that someone leaked to TechCrunch. His reputation took another hit. The SEC investigation took 6 months, but the result was worth the wait. Marcus was charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. Paul Morrison, our former CFO, took a plea deal and testified against him. The evidence was damning. Marcus's lawyers argued for leniency. It was his first offense. He had no prior criminal record. He was under stress from the divorce. The judge wasn't sympathetic. 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He'd also have to pay back the $42 million he'd stolen, plus penalties. By the time sentencing happened, I'd already moved on. Nexus had grown into one of the most valuable tech companies in the country. Our licensing deals were bringing in steady revenue, and we'd attracted mob engineering talent from across the industry. I'd hired a new CFO, expanded our board, and established a culture of transparency and accountability. I'd also started dating again, carefully, slowly, with eyes wide open. Nothing serious yet, but it felt good to remember that not every relationship was built on lies and exploitation. The day Marcus went to prison, I didn't attend the sentencing. I had better things to do, like meeting with a Fortune 100 company about licensing our technology for their entire supply chain, like approving bonuses for my engineering team, like living my life without looking over my shoulder, waiting for the knife. 3 years after Marcus's arrest, I got a letter forwarded from my lawyer. It was from him, written on prison stationery in his careful handwriting. Olivia, I know you probably won't read this, but I needed to try. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, about the choices I made. I was wrong about everything, about you, about us, about what really mattered. I told myself I was the brilliant one, the irreplaceable one, but the truth is, you were always the genius. I was just good at selling your ideas. And instead of being grateful for that, instead of building something real with you, I tried to take everything for myself. I know there's no apology that can undo the damage I caused. I know you'll never forgive me, and you shouldn't. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. You weren't cruel for enforcing that loyalty clause. You were just protecting yourself from me. I hope Nexus continues to succeed. I hope you find someone who deserves you. I hope you're happy. I deserve everything that happened to me. You deserved none of what I put you through. Marcus. I read the letter once, then filed it away in a folder I kept for legal purposes. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Marcus had shown me exactly who he was in my first life, and I'd learned the lesson well enough that I didn't need to repeat it in this one. The loyalty clause he'd forced me to sign, the trap he'd set for me, had become his own undoing. He'd thought he was protecting his interests, making sure I couldn't leave him without losing everything. Instead, he'd given me the weapon I needed to destroy him. Ironic, really. But then, Marcus had always underestimated me. That was his fatal flaw. I thought about the woman I'd been in my first life, trusting, naive, convinced that love meant giving someone power over you. That woman had died in the bay, sedated and helpless, while the man she loved stood on the dock and watched. But I'd been given a second chance. I'd come back with knowledge, with clarity, with a determination to never be helpless again. And I'd used every advantage I had to make sure Marcus could never hurt me or anyone else again. Some people might call it revenge. I called it justice. 5 years after Rebirth, Nexus Technologies went public. The IPO was the largest tech offering of the year, valuing the company at $12 billion. I rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange, surrounded by my team, people who'd earned their positions through talent and hard work, not manipulation and theft. The press called me a tech visionary, a genius, a self-made billionaire. They wrote articles about my rise, my innovative algorithms, my leadership style. Some of them mentioned Marcus, but only as a footnote. The ex-husband who'd tried to steal my company and failed. I didn't correct them when they called me self-made. I'd had help, of course. Jennifer Park's advice, Thomas Rodriguez's forensic skills, the loyalty of employees who'd seen through Marcus's charm. But I'd also had something Marcus never understood: actual talent, real skill. The ability to build something valuable instead of just taking credit for someone else's work. The night of the IPO, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, bought with my own money, no shared assets, and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, Marcus was finishing his prison sentence. He'd be released soon with nothing to his name, no company, no reputation, no prospects. The non-compete clause in his contract with Nexus was still in effect, so he couldn't even work in tech for another 2 years. He'd have to start over from scratch at 45 years old with a criminal record and a ruined reputation. Everything he'd built on the foundation of my work was gone. And me? I had everything he'd tried to take. The company, the success, the respect. But more than that, I had something I'd never had in my first life. Freedom. The freedom to trust my own judgment, to value my own contributions, to demand respect instead of accepting scraps. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Park. "Champagne tomorrow to celebrate? You earned it." I smiled and typed back, "Absolutely, I'm buying." She responded with a champagne emoji, and I laughed. Jennifer had become a real friend over the years, not just a business ally. She taught me that professional relationships didn't have to be transactional, that you could build genuine connections based on mutual respect. I'd learned a lot of lessons in my second life, about trust, about power, about the importance of protecting yourself. But the biggest lesson was this: loyalty was a two-way street. Marcus had demanded loyalty from me while that was his, planning to betray me at every turn. He'd thought he could use a contract clause to control me, to make sure I'd never challenge him. Instead, that loyalty clause had been his downfall. By creating a weapon to use against me, he'd given me the exact tool I needed to destroy him. The contract he'd drafted so carefully, with its ironclad non-compete provisions and severe penalties for violation, had seemed like his insurance policy. But insurance only pays out when you follow the rules. And Marcus had broken every single one. 7 years after Rebirth, I sold Nexus Technologies to a major tech conglomerate for $18 billion. I could have kept running the company, but I was ready for something new. I'd proven everything I needed to prove. I'd built something extraordinary, protected it from those who'd tried to steal it, and created value that couldn't be denied. The acquisition made headlines. Forbes put me on their cover. Olivia Chen, the billionaire who built an empire on her own terms. The article detailed my journey, the early days of Nexus, the technical innovations I'd developed, the dramatic board battle that had ousted my co-founder for corporate espionage. They painted Marcus as a villain, which wasn't entirely fair. He was more complicated than that, ambitious, insecure, willing to do terrible things to maintain his position. But the complexity didn't excuse what he'd done. Actions had consequences, and he was living with his. I used part of the acquisition money to start a venture capital firm focused on supporting women in tech. Too many brilliant women had their ideas stolen, their contributions minimized, their careers sabotaged by men who felt threatened by their talent. I'd been lucky. I'd gotten a second chance to fight back. Most women didn't. My first investment was in a startup founded by Sarah Kim, who'd been one of my lead engineers at Nexus. She'd developed an AI system for medical diagnostics that was revolutionary. In another timeline, maybe some man would have stolen her ideas and taken credit. In this one, I made sure she had the resources and support to succeed on her own terms. "Thank you for believing in me," Sarah said when I signed the investment paperwork. "I believe in backing brilliant people," I replied, "especially when they've earned it." 10 years after Rebirth, I ran into Sabrina at a tech conference in San Francisco. I almost didn't recognize her. She'd aged badly, the sharp edges that had made her striking now just making her look hard. She was working for a mid-tier consulting firm, according to her badge. A long fall from the heights she'd planned to reach with Marcus. "Olivia," she said, her smile brittle. "Congratulations on all your success. You've done amazingly well." "Thank you." I kept my voice neutral, professional. "I wanted to apologize," she continued, "for my role in everything that happened with Marcus. I was young and stupid and—" "It's fine." Interrupted. I didn't want her apology. It meant nothing. Water under the bridge. "Really?" She looked surprised. "Really? Marcus made his own choices. So did you. I'm not interested in rehashing ancient history." What I didn't say was that she was irrelevant to me now. In my first life, discovering their affair had broken my heart. In this life, they'd been nothing but tools in my revenge. Useful antagonists whose betrayal had given me the moral clarity to destroy Marcus without guilt. I'd won, completely, thoroughly, without question, and they'd lost everything. That was enough. "Well," Sabrina said awkwardly, "I'm glad there are no hard feelings." There were no feelings at all, hard or otherwise. She was a stranger who'd once tried to hurt me and failed. That was all. I excused myself and moved on, back to the panel I was moderating about AI ethics. I had actual important work to do. I couldn't waste time on people who'd chosen to be obstacles in my path. 15 years after Rebirth, I got word that Marcus had died, heart attack, sudden, at only 55. He'd been working as a mid-level manager at a regional tech company, never having recovered his reputation or his fortune. The obituary mentioned his early success at Nexus, but spent more time on his criminal conviction and fall from grace. I felt nothing when I read the news. Not satisfaction, not regret, just a kind of neutral acknowledgement. He'd been a problem I'd solved, a threat I'd neutralized. His death was just the final punctuation mark on a story that had ended for me years ago. Some people might say I was cold, that I should feel something, guilt, perhaps, or vindication, or at least a twinge of the love I'd once felt for him. But I'd used up all my emotions on Marcus in my first life. I'd loved him, trusted him, mourned him. In this life, he'd just been an obstacle to remove. And I'd removed him with the very tool he'd created to control me. The loyalty clause. That simple contract provision written to ensure I could never leave him without losing everything. He'd been so proud of it, so confident that it made him untouchable. He'd forced me to sign it right after our wedding, when I'd still been too in love to see the red flags. "It protects both of us," he'd said, "make sure neither one can sabotage the company." But he'd been planning to sabotage it all along, to steal everything I'd built and leave me with nothing. The loyalty clause had been his insurance policy, a way to keep me trapped even if I discovered his betrayal. He'd never imagined I'd turn it against him, that I'd document his violations, build an airtight case, and use his own contract to strip him of everything he valued. He'd underestimated me so fundamentally that he'd handed me the weapon of his own destruction. There was a certain poetry to that, a symmetry that satisfied something deep in my soul. I didn't attend Marcus's funeral. I sent a modest flower. Arrangement, professional courtesy, nothing more. I heard later that Sabrina didn't attend either. He'd died alone, his glory days long behind him, remembered more for his crimes than his achievements. Meanwhile, I was living my best life. I'd remarried, a kind, stable man who worked in healthcare and had no interest in tech beyond using his phone. He loved me for who I was, not what I could build for him. We had 2 daughters who were growing up fierce and confident, taught from birth that their ideas mattered and their contributions deserved recognition. I ran my venture capital firm, invested in brilliant founders, mentored young women in tech. I spoke at conferences, wrote op-eds about corporate governance and intellectual property rights. I built a legacy that was entirely my own, untainted by theft or betrayal. And sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, I thought about my first life. About the woman I'd been, trusting, naive, ultimately expendable. About the cold water closing over my head, the sedatives making me too weak to swim. About Marcus standing on the dock watching me die. That woman was gone. She'd drowned in the bay, and someone harder had taken her place. Someone who understood that trust was earned, that loyalty was reciprocal, and that the only person you could truly rely on was yourself. Marcus had taught me that lesson with his betrayal, and I'd made sure he paid the ultimate price for the education. 20 years after Rebirth, I was invited to give a commencement speech at MIT. The students sat in front of me, bright-eyed and eager, ready to change the world with their brilliance and innovation. You're about to enter an industry that doesn't always value merit, I told them. You'll work with people who will try to take credit for your ideas. You'll encounter bosses who will demand loyalty while offering none in return. You'll face situations where trust feels impossible and paranoia feels justified. I paused, looking out at the sea of faces. My advice is this: protect yourself. Document your contributions. Get things in writing. Don't sign contracts without understanding every word, and never, ever assume that someone's love or friendship means they won't betray you. Some of the students looked uncomfortable. This wasn't the inspirational message they'd expected. But here's the other thing, I continued. Protect yourself, yes, but don't become so guarded that you can't build anything real. Trust carefully, but trust. Collaborate thoughtfully, but collaborate. The best work happens when brilliant people work together in good faith. How do you know who to trust? A student called out. I smiled. You watch what they do when they think no one's looking. You see how they treat people who can't benefit them. You pay attention to whether their actions match their words, and you always, always keep your own records. After the speech, several students came up to ask questions. One young woman, her face serious, said, I heard about what happened with your ex-husband. That he tried to steal your company. He did. How did you stop him? I used his own weapon against him, I said simply. He made me sign a contract designed to control me. But contracts work both ways. When he violated the terms, I enforced them. He lost everything. Weren't you afraid? Terrified, I admitted. But I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't fight back. Fear is useful if it motivates you to act, not if it paralyzes you. The student nodded slowly. I'm going to remember that. Good, I said. And remember this too. You are valuable. Your work matters. Your ideas are worth protecting. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise. Now, 25 years after Rebirth, I'm 63 years old. I've achieved more than I ever dreamed possible in my first life. I've built companies, invested in founders, changed industries. I've raised daughters who are fierce and brilliant and unafraid to demand what they've earned. I've loved and been loved without fear or manipulation. And I've never forgotten the lesson Marcus taught me. Loyalty is meaningless without integrity. A contract is only as good as the people who sign it. And sometimes, The weapon someone creates to hurt you becomes the tool of their own destruction. The loyalty clause that Marcus forced me to sign, that ironclad, carefully worded provision designed to trap me, ended up being the noose around his own neck. He'd been so confident in his superiority, so sure that I'd never challenge him, that he'd never imagined I'd enforce the very contract he'd created. That was his fatal mistake. He'd underestimated me from the beginning, and that underestimation had cost him everything. I keep a copy of that contract in my office, framed on the wall. Not as a trophy, I'm not that petty, but as a reminder. A reminder that your own weapons can be turned against you. That arrogance breeds blindness, that the people you underestimate are often the ones who will bring you down. Students sometimes ask me about it when they visit. "What's that?" they'll say, pointing to the framed document. "A lesson," I tell them, about loyalty, about trust, and about the importance of reading every word before you sign. They usually laugh, thinking I'm joking, but I'm not. That contract, those pages of dense legal language that Marcus thought would bind me to him forever, represents everything I learned in my second chance at life. You can't control people through fear and manipulation forever. Eventually, they'll learn to fight back. And when they do, the weapons you've created to hurt them become the instruments of your own destruction. Marcus learned that lesson too late, but he learned it thoroughly, completely, irreversibly. And I learned that death isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's a rebirth, a chance to do things differently, to be stronger, to refuse victimhood. Marcus made me sign a loyalty clause thinking it would trap me forever. Instead, after rebirth, I enforced his clause and watched his entire world collapse. He lost his company, his reputation, his freedom, his future. And I gained everything he'd tried to steal. That's the real meaning of loyalty, not blind obedience, but reciprocal respect. Not manipulation disguised as love, but honest partnership built on mutual trust. Marcus never understood that, and his failure to understand cost him everything. As for me, I'm living proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's success. It's building something so magnificent that your enemy's attempts to destroy you become footnotes in your story of triumph. The loyalty clause was supposed to be my cage. Instead, it became my weapon, my shield, and ultimately, my liberation.